Well, thank you for coming. I'm on a little book tour right now to talk to people about Sweetie Pie, which is my latest title. But I found that people are also curious about other things about my work, about me, and so I'm also prepared to share some of those stories. Over the years, I've gotten quite a bit of mail from people who like my books, sometimes from people who don't like my books. Not as many of those, fortunately. But I get asked some questions repeatedly, and one question turns up most often. And any guesses on what that question might be? The most frequently asked question of a children's author.
Where do you get your ideas?
Yes, absolutely. Number one question. Number two question is, how did you end up doing this? And then, in my case, number three question is, what's with the little white dog? So I'm going to answer those questions. And take a little drink of water here first. I'm actually an illustrator, author, somewhat by accident. A lot of times when people grow up to be artists, pursuits like that, musicians, writers, actors, those are usually things that they've sensed in themselves when they were quite young, and maybe before they were 10 or 11, they decided that's what I really want to do. And so from that age onward, they pursue that. And they get their parents, or maybe their parents identify it in them, and they get lessons. They take acting lessons or flute lessons or dancing lessons, and those young prodigies, those young geniuses grow up to be adult artists. In my case, I didn't really have much interest in art when I was a kid. I used to like to ride my bike around out in the neighborhood. I used to play in the fields. Did not really spend a lot of time at my desk with a pile of crayons, dreaming of the day I would make a children's book. And I stayed like that pretty much all through high school, even when I got to be, 13, 14, 15, 16. It was still not something I magically identified in myself, and one day woke up and said, yes, I know what I'm cut out for. I'm cut out to be a storyteller. It just simply never happened. And what did happen was I reached the end of high school. I was a senior and was applying to colleges. I grew up in Grand Rapids, Michigan, and way back in the 1960s, they had a system where someone from University of Michigan admissions would come to your high school, and this person could sit down with you, a little meeting in the guidance counselor's office, and you could have a conversation with that person, and they would look at your transcript, and they would look at your SAT scores, and they would have a conversation that would convince them that you were worthy of becoming a University of Michigan student, and at the end of that half-hour meeting, you were in. None of this high anxiety waiting for the envelope. And so that happened to me. So I went into a meeting to decide whether or not I was going to go to the University of Michigan, and furthermore, what I wanted to do when I got there. So I sat down with this gentleman, and we talked a little bit about my interests, and he said, well, Chris, what do you think you want to do when you get to college? And I had no idea, but I had in hand the brochure that listed the kinds of things that you could study at the college, which would be things like, I could study language, I could study geology, I could study, psychology. But there was a school that was called A&D within the university, the School of A&D. And so I asked the man, well, what is that? And he said, that's the School of Architecture and Design. It's the art school. And as I say, I hadn't done any art since I was probably in third grade. But when he said the art school, it had never occurred to me that you could get a college degree doing art. And so I had about 2 or 3 minutes there to reflect. And I was thinking, art. Well, that was fun. I liked finger painting in 2nd grade. I liked making little things out of clay in 4th grade. And so I said to him, you know, that sounds great. I'd like to be an art student. I'd like to be an art major. So he said, okay. But then he looked at my transcript. This is the list of courses that you've taken while you've been in high school. And there was no art there at all. And he said, well, Mr. Van Allsburg, I see you haven't taken any art. And so I felt challenged then, and I felt challenged to persuade him that I deserved to be an artist, based on 3 minutes reflection of what it might be like. And so I said to him, well, of course, my own skill level is at a stage right now where I can't really get any benefit from what happens here in the high school program. And I've been studying privately for the last few years. And I have a studio set up on my front porch where I do some stone carving. And I have another little space set up to do some painting. And that's mostly how I spend my free time. And he wasn't absolutely convinced, I don't think, but he'd probably never heard that before. So he posed for me an important question. And I'm not sure when he asked it exactly what he was trying to figure out, but he asked me very seriously, he said, Chris, what do you think of Norman Rockwell? Well, this was the late 1960s, and Norman Rockwell was, as many of you may remember, and some of you know, Norman Rockwell painted pictures for Post magazine, painted covers. And around that time, there was some controversy around this illustrator artist because people thought he was just a sentimentalist, that he was a glorified greeting card illustrator, and that he deserved no more respect than you would give a greeting card illustrator. But there was another school of thought, which was that this man had an extraordinary gift for capturing a feeling about America that Americans connected to. Even Americans that weren't alive for some of the scenes that he painted still felt an emotional response to these pictures. So I had to figure out, was he trying to figure out how sophisticated I was? Or was he trying to figure out if I had certain kinds of artistic values that he had? So I measured up the man, and I'm figuring, well, he's there, he's wearing white socks, he's got short sleeve shirt, and he's wearing a tie, and pocket protector, he's got a crew cut. And I'm trying to figure out, well, is he really wondering how sophisticated I am? And I thought not. So I told him, I said, you know, I know things the people are saying about Norman Rockwell. I personally think that he's a genius, that he has been able to record in these vignettes feelings about America that communicate an American identity that so many people connect with. And he's like a dramatist. He's like a director. It's like a film, but it's just a picture. And when I was done making my defense of Norman Rockwell, he pounded his fist on the table and he said, Chris, you are right. And then he took out my application and he checked it off, and I was, at that point, a University of Michigan art major. So what I found out when I got to the University of Michigan a few months later was that I was surrounded by people who actually did study privately on weekends and had been doing so for years. And so when I got to the art school, I saw people who could draw with exceptional skill and what I thought was, you know, born talent. And because I couldn't draw like that, I felt like I'd made a terrible mistake, that I was in way over my head. And I didn't appreciate that a lot of being good at drawing it has to do with having done it a lot and having learned how to do it. But I shied away from drawing because I felt I didn't measure up, I wasn't good enough. But I did take a course as a freshman in three-dimensional design, and that's basically Introduction to Sculpture. And so I responded to that quickly because As a child, I didn't draw pictures and dream about writing stories, but I did build model boats and model planes and model cars, and I was very good with my hands, probably in a way that maybe concerned my parents, because I would go into the basement for an entire summer and come upstairs with a fully rigged model of the HMS Bounty. And an unusual kind of achievement for an 8-year-old. My parents decided not to find therapy for me, but I was good at it. I was really good with my hands, and that's what I rediscovered when I took a sculpture course as a 18, 19-year-old. I rediscovered this love of making things. You know, I wasn't making model boats anymore, but I was using my hands and I was using materials. And so I did that all through my 4 years at the University of Michigan. And at the end of that time, I went on to the Rhode Island School of Design and continued to study sculpture. So that's a description of my accidental sort of becoming an artist. It wasn't a plan. It was an impulse that happened over a 3-minute period while I was sitting in a high school guidance counselor's office. It was a turning point in my life. I didn't appreciate it at the time, but nonetheless, I was a 22-year-old, 23-year-old, and now I was a sculptor, and I set up a sculpture studio in Providence, Rhode Island, and I started making sculpture. The kinds of sculpture I made, I worked in wood and I worked in bronze. I was interested in calamities, and I would do bronze castings of train wrecks and bronze castings of plane wrecks, bronze castings of sinking boats, bronze castings of things that were broken after they'd fallen off tables. There's a theme there, and I'm not sure what it was, but I liked the idea of stopping time as a sculptor and making things sort of just stop. Spilling coffee. I did a little sculpture of a spilling cup of coffee where the coffee's just lipping over the edge, but it never really falls out because it's a sculpture. So that's the sculpture I made, and I was content making it. There was a gallery in New York City that was willing to show my work and was selling my work. And at about that time, I had to move from one sculpture studio to another. And this other sculpture studio I moved into, a big building with lots of different studios in it that had a landlord who was not particularly open-hearted, generous. He turned the heat off at 5 o'clock every afternoon. Not a big deal in September, October. But when it got to be winter, it was impossible to work at night. And that was my habit as a passionate young artist. I would go in and work till midnight because that's when the juices were flowing. But juices don't flow when it's 40 degrees. And I found it impossible to work in my frigid studio. So I needed a hobby. And I'd been drawing pictures all the while I'd been in art school. I'd been drawing pictures, but I didn't draw pictures of people. I didn't draw pictures of places. I just drew pictures of the things that I was going to build. So if I was going to build a sculpture of a train wreck, then I would draw the picture of the train off the tracks and all kind of bent and twisted. And I would draw that picture so that I could make the sculpture of it. So I had been drawing, and I knew how to use a pencil, but I hadn't drawn pictures of people, places, things, aside from sculpture. So that was my hobby, and I can remember sitting down to draw a picture. One of the first ones I drew, and I'm not sure what the inspiration was. It was a picture of a dinner table, a round dinner table, and there were chairs set around it, and there were people all dressed up, and dinner was about to be served, you could tell, but there was no food on the plates yet. And one of the dinner guests had picked up the plate, and he was eating the plate, and little bits of china were on the front of his tuxedo. And I simply titled it The Impatient Dinner Guest. And I did a number of drawings like that were just peculiar things happening. Sometimes I gave them titles like captions. And it was truly my hobby. I still made sculpture, didn't expect that drawings would amount to anything. But I had a friend who was an illustrator. His name was David Macaulay, who's fairly well known for doing books about architecture, very well illustrated books about architecture. And so he had a publisher, and he saw some of my drawings. He said, Chris, you know, sometimes artists, if their work is described as illustration, are offended because there's a kind of a status between fine art and illustration. And he said my pictures looked like illustration, but I wasn't offended because I actually did think they looked like illustration. And he said, I think you should show these to my editor up in Boston. So I was too shy to do that. My wife took some pictures up to Boston, and the editor looked at these pictures that I'd drawn, all in black and white, which was not a common medium for children's book illustration. But the editor up there, he liked him. He said, I think these are very interesting drawings, and I'm wondering if Chris would like to illustrate some stories. And my wife said, well, I think he might be interested because he let me bring these pictures up and show them to you. So he sent back some manuscripts. And manuscripts are the stories that do not have pictures with them yet. And I read them, and they were stories about little bunny rabbits going to kindergarten for the first day, and they would be worried about whether or not they had enough carrots in their backpack, and whether their little bunny friends would be able to sit next to them on the bus. And so those are a certain kind of book. Maybe some of you kids have read books like those and liked them, especially just before you went to kindergarten. Maybe you thought they were comforting. They made you feel good about kindergarten, but I didn't like them. I mean, I shouldn't say I didn't like them. I didn't feel like I could draw pictures for them. So I called up the editor and I said, you know, I just can't draw bunnies with backpacks. I don't think I can do it. And he said, I understand. So some time went by, and he called me again, and he said, you know, I can't get these pictures out of my mind that you drew, and I really think you should, there's a possibility, there's an opportunity for you as a book illustrator, and if you're worried about drawing bunnies with backpacks, then the solution is simple. You just have to write your own story and don't write about bunnies with backpacks. And so I'd never written anything. A couple postcards maybe, but I'd never written a story. So that was a challenge for me, but I accepted it. So I said, okay, I'll give it a try. And at that time, I was writing or drawing pictures about, the subject matter was topiary gardens. And those are gardens where bushes are pruned into funny shapes, the shapes of animals or geometric objects. And so I had one of those pictures of a topiary garden, and I thought, well, maybe this could be the beginning of a story, but a picture of a garden is not a story. And so I had the picture of the garden, and I thought, well, that's okay. It's kind of unusual. You don't see gardens like that every day. But I thought something needed to happen in the garden. So I thought, well, maybe there's an animal running through the garden. So I had, okay, so now I have a picture with a dog running through a garden. Well, that's still not really a story. I mean, that's just something happening. Dog runs through a garden. End of story. Not very interesting. Not very long either, but I thought, okay, well, what if the dog is running away from someone? Maybe he's running away from a boy. So I put a boy in the picture too. So now the boy is chasing the dog, and he's chasing the dog through a very strange garden. So now I started to have things that were sort of not really a story, but they were something more than just simple action, because now I could start asking and answering some questions. So the questions I asked myself was, well, who owns the garden? Whose garden is that? Why is it a problem that the dog is running away? Why is the boy worried? And as I worked on it, some ideas came to me, and one of them was, well, the garden is owned by a very strange individual, and he doesn't like dogs. So that seemed like so now I had a character idea, an idea for a character. And I also had an idea for the dog. He was mischievous. He was unruly. And I also had an idea for the boy that it wasn't his dog, but a dog that he had to take care of, so he was worried about losing track of the dog. So as I worked on the story, I decided, yes, this is a garden owned by a magician. And I was writing the story originally in couplets. Those are lines that rhyme. So I wrote a line which went, deep in the garden lives da-da-da-da-da. I didn't have a name yet. But I had the next line, which was, has never been seen but is thought to be crazy. So I went back and filled in a name. Deep in the garden lives ABDUL GASAZI, who's never been seen but is thought to be crazy. So now I had a name for the strange character who owned the garden, and I also had an idea that he could be a magician. And so at that point, I felt a story was actually presenting itself to me, and that when this dog finally ran away from this boy, and the magician got a hold of the dog, something bad would happen, because the magician, well, he wasn't evil, but he was not a nice person. Something bad would happen, and something does happen which is bad, which is that when the boy finally goes to the magician's house and says, have you seen my dog? The magician says, yes, I have seen your dog. He's right there. And what he points to is not a dog, but a duck. So the boy says, oh, no, this dog I was supposed to take care of is now quacks instead of barks and is a duck. But he knows he has to return the duck to the owner, who actually thinks she's going to get her dog back, but instead he returns to the owner of the dog with a duck and apologizes for what's happened. But before he actually gets there, the duck flies away. So not only does can he not return the duck, he's got nothing to show for it, and he returns to the woman who owns the dog and says, very, very, very sorry. Your dog got turned into a duck. It flew away. I think that's the end of it. And then the dog appears back in his doggy form. He barks. He's not a duck anymore. So that's where the story ends. And there's a little clue there that suggests that maybe the dog never was a duck, or maybe he was a duck. So what I discovered in writing this story was that even though I started out with just a picture of a garden, that I'd written a story that compared the kind of magic that stage magicians do. You've seen a guy pull a rabbit out of a hat? Yes? Yes? Do you think that's real magic, or was the rabbit hiding in the hat? Yeah, okay, right. That's called stage magic. But the real magic, the kind of Harry Potter magic, that's real magic, right? So I had ended up writing a book without even planning on it that sort of compared the two. Well, what do you believe? Do you believe that somebody can do real magic, like a miracle, or do you believe that magicians just fool people? And I didn't answer it in the book. The answer's not there. The reader has to decide for themselves. So I finished my story, and I was proud of it, because it was the first one I'd ever written, so I actually wrote a story. And I also liked the idea that it didn't have a clear ending. It had an unresolved ending, and most kids' books aren't like that. So I sent it up to my editor, and I said, well, what do you think? I thought he was probably going to reject it because it had an unresolved ending. It already was going to have black and white illustrations. I thought the combination of the two would doom the thing as a book. And he said, love it, it's great. So let's publish it. And so he did, or my publishing house did, Houghton Mifflin. And I thought they'd do a short print run, that would be it. I'd have a bunch of remaindered copies that I could buy and use as Christmas gifts. But to my amazement, see, it's got a sticker on it, right? So when you're in school, you get a silver sticker on your paper. It's good news, right? So same thing here. Really surprised me because I thought the book was too unconventional to be well received. But it was, and so I was proud of myself, but not so proud that I thought I was now a book illustrator, I still thought I was a sculptor, so I went back and I kept on making sculpture. But then after some time passed, I thought, I bet I can do it better if I do it again, because you almost always do something better the second time. It's called practice, right? So I had some practice with the first book, and so I decided to do a second book. And it was this one. So I got better at drawing things, because I learned some really simple things, like it's a lot easier to draw something if you know what it looks like. So I started using models, and for this I got some models for the rhinoceros models. They weren't living models, they were plastic, and they were about this big. So I got some plastic rhinoceros. I got some living children to be my models, and I'd also learned how to draw better, how to control the materials, and I was using different materials. The first book was done in kind of a hard carbon pencil, and these were done in sort of a charcoal Conte pencil. So they look a little bit different, which was satisfying to me, because I didn't want to just do the same thing over. And there are the rhinos. Right. So actually, so this one was published, and I thought maybe I just got lucky with the first one, because I got a sticker on it. And so this one came out, and look, hey, I got another sticker. So feeling pretty good about myself, briefly, because at that point, I think I sort of made a decision, well, maybe I should spend more time in my drawing studio, less time in the sculpture studio, though I was selling my sculpture, but there was something about the picture making and storytelling thing that started to be a little more compelling to me. So I decided I would try another book, and so this is my my third book, and this was stimulated by some ideas I've had about dreaming, and my belief is that if you go to sleep and you start dreaming, and there are things in the external world that you are still sensitive to, then they will be incorporated in your dream. Like if you were dreaming and you heard a dog barking, in your dream you might actually see a dog, right? Makes sense? So this is a story about a boy who goes home to study about the great landmarks of the world, and he has his book open in his lap, and while he's reading about the landmarks, a deluge begins, and it rains very heavily outside his window. And so those two things combine. He's reading about the great landmarks while this torrential rainpour is happening outside, and so they combine. So he sees the world underwater. So he goes past all the great monuments, and one of them he goes past is the Sphinx. And what he sees here is quite unusual. He sees a little house with a person in it waving at him. He never sees this in front of any of the other things. He only sees it here. So anyway, he goes all the way around the world in his dream, and then he wakes up. And he wakes up because his young friend is knocking at the window. The rain has stopped, and the young friend, a little girl, says, "Do you want to go outside and play baseball?" which was what their plan was before it began to rain. So they go outside, and they're on their way to go play, and she says to her friend, the boy who'd had the dream, Ben, she says, "I had the craziest dream. You'll never guess what I saw when I went past the Sphinx." Oh, no, he says that to her. He says, "I had a crazy dream, and I went past the Sphinx. You'll never guess what I saw." And she says to him, "Oh, yes, you saw me in my house waving." And he said, "Well, how did you know?" And she said, "Because I had the same dream." So my idea here was, if two people had the same dream, would they be able to meet each other when they were there? So that was my third book, and once again an idea that I wasn't sure my publisher was going to be excited about, but they were, and they published it. So this is This is a story about whether or not you can see someone who has the same dream in your dream. So I'll skip over some of these because I want to spend a little bit of time on Sweetie Pie. Yeah. Well, maybe I'll spend. Oh yeah. So this is my alphabet book called The Z Was Zapped, and a lot of the things that I have to draw, that I have drawn in the past, I have to make up. Jumanji would be a good example. Even though I had little models of rhinoceros, I still had to sort of make up what it was like if they were going to run through my dining room. And so I thought I would have a lot of fun drawing things that I could actually look at. So I built a little stage with a curtain, and I cut out letters out of wood, and then I put them in the stage and I lit them. I was not able to make lightning, so I did make up the lightning, but everything else I was able to draw exactly what I was looking at, which is the way art has been made almost forever, is that you draw what you see. So in this case, I drew the entire alphabet. Here, I did draw everything that I was looking at. I went to the pet shop. I got a small little fish bowl. I got a fish. And because this somewhat relates to my last book, I want to make clear no animals were harmed in the production of this picture. I talked to the pet shop owner. I said, I just need to draw the picture of this goldfish. It will take me less than an hour. Can I bring it right back? And he said, okay. So this fish briefly swam around the D, and then I bagged it back up and took it to the pet store. But this is an alphabet book. Now I'm sure all of you have had, as youngsters, you've had alphabet books, right? A is for apple, B is for banana, C is for cherry. Do you find that boring? Yeah, so do I. So anyway, I thought it would be great if there was an alphabet book that had to do with verbs instead of things. And I'm not a pedagogue, and that means someone who's actually studies the science of learning. But I had an idea that if kids were exposed to letters that were associated with verbs, they would learn the letters faster. And according to my fan mail, it works, because teachers say that, you know, I've had kids who struggle for a long time, and once they see the D drowning, they don't forget. So this is another story that's very easy for me to describe where the idea came from, because I just walked into my kitchen one day, kitchen counter, there were 2 ants. And I started to wonder, well, if I went ahead and started making breakfast and those 2 ants, I didn't see them, they didn't see me, the ants could have a really bad morning. And in fact, that's what happens to these ants. I'm not sure what the next picture is. No, I don't have much of that. This is the ants. So anyway, this is where the story begins, because in my imagination, I saw these ants on my kitchen top close to a bowl of sugar. So I imagined that at some point, a single ant had come into my kitchen and found a grain of sugar and taken it back to the ant nest way outside. A very, very long trip if you're that big, and we're talking about a house. And that ant brought back that little crystal of sugar, and the news went through the ant world right away. Some very special stuff up in that house. So all the ants wanted to go get it, and who here knows what the ants like to do with those things once they get them? What do they do with the little bits of food and sugar that they find? Any ideas? They share them? They do share them, but who do they share them with? Because there's one special person. Yes? The queen, yes. All right, so the way the ant world works is that, and it only works this way, is if the ants, they love the queen so much they have to bring the sugar to the queen. They'd probably like a little bit for themselves, but they bring it to the queen because she's the mother of them all, and her happiness is their happiness. So anyway, these ants go off, and they climb. When they climb, see, this is them just moving through the lawn, but for an ant, my backyard is a jungle, right? So this is my backyard, and this is the ants, and they're on their way to my house. And so really bad things happen to two of the bad ants, because when they get to the sugar bowl in my kitchen, all the other ants go in, they take a grain of sugar, and then they climb out, they go back, and they retrace their path, and they go back to their little ant home outside, and they deliver the sugar there. These two ants get into the bowl, and they think it's really nice. It's especially nice to stay there because they'll just have the sugar to themselves. So that's a real kind of traditional story idea, which is that you create a couple of characters who misbehave and then you punish them. So bad things happen to the ants. They get ground up in a garbage disposal. They get electrocuted. They get fried in the toaster. But they survive. They live through it all, and they live through to the next night when their fellow ants come back to get more sugar for the queen. And then these two bad ants, what they do is they just fall in line, they get the sugar, and they follow their fellow ants back to the ant world. And so they now are two good ants. Now, when I wrote the story, some people asked me, "Gosh, Chris, this seems like a story about conforming, that you have to be like every other ant." And actually, a couple years after I wrote this book, a film came out whose theme was basically about that this ants conforming. But my story was about something else. It was about the reality of accepting how your nature fits into your life, and how ignoring your nature leads to bad ends. So the ants weren't really bad. They just forgot what their program was and their nature, because frankly they were much happier when they went back to the nest. I guess that is kind of a conservative idea, but comforting to me. A story about the future. Oh, yeah. So, yeah. This is the way this story evolved is actually kind of interesting, because an illustrator from Walt Disney Studios, a young person who was very interested in new technologies for animation, contacted me, and he liked the way I drew, and he thought that I might be able to contribute something to this new kind of animation that he was so interested in doing at the Disney Studios. And so he visited Providence, and we talked about contributions that I might be able to make, and then he went back to California, and we sort of parted ways for a while, and then I learned that he left Disney Studios, and he went to another small studio in Northern California, and he contacted me again, and he said, "You know, this technology we have is really great, but we need a story that has a character in it that works well with the technology, that doesn't show off the weaknesses of the technology." And he said, "Would you be willing to work on a story?" So I looked at the sample reel that showed what they could do with their technology, and I thought, well, you can't do people. The technology clearly is not good enough for that, but you could really bring things to life. You could make things come alive. And so I wrote this story about a broom, a witch's broom that comes to life. And then when I was done with it, I called my friend, the animator. I said, "I think I got a story that might work for us." And he said, "Great, Chris, so grateful that you worked on that, but I'm working on a story that's just got a bunch of toys in it instead." So that was Toy Story. So the broom was never going to make it to the big screen, but I liked the idea so much that I went ahead and wrote a story about a broom which belongs to a witch, but it got old. It couldn't fly anymore, but it could still do some nice little things around the house, like sweep. And that's the story. It's actually a story about intolerance because the people who live near the widow who has the broom think the broom is evil. But of course, it's not evil. It just happened to be associated with an evil person, namely the witch. This is the sweetest fig. Maybe I'll cruise past this because this is one that's another very easy idea to describe where the idea came from, and it's so simple. I hope it inspires you to believe that ideas are all around you, and sometimes they're underneath your feet, sometimes they're over your head, sometimes they're sneaking up from behind you, but there's ideas all around, and it's really a matter of sort of using your imagination and looking at something and seeing where it leads. And in this case, I walked into my 3-year-old daughter's bedroom one day, and she had on the floor a coloring book, which she'd been working on, and it was a Peter Pan coloring book that had a picture of Princess Tiger Lily in it. And Princess Tiger Lily had this terrified expression on her face because she was sinking in a pool of water because she was drowning. She could not swim, and she was crying out for Peter to save her. And you could see Peter off in the distance, but in the foreground, it was just Princess Tiger Lily looking like this. And so when I looked at what my daughter had done to this picture, she'd taken purple and green and brown crayons, and she'd gone all back and forth Princess Tiger Lily's face, and it looked to me like Princess Tiger Lily was doing this because of what my daughter had done with the crayons. So I was thinking about that for a while, and so it occurred to me, well, there could be a reality, which is a coloring book, which has not been opened yet. It's been in a book, it's been in a toy store or a library, and it's been closed, and the people who live there are happy because nothing bad ever happens. Every day is just the same. But then one day, that coloring book gets purchased and is given to a little boy as a birthday gift, and then bad things happen. And so what happens in this story is that everything's really perfect in this little western town, but then one day the stagecoach comes into town, the horses are all covered with this terrible stuff, and the sheriff goes out of town to find the coachman who's missing, and he hears this fellow mumbling from behind a rock, and he goes around and discovers this, which is really bad news. So this is eventually what's going to happen to everybody in the coloring book, and they really don't know how to deal with it because that's life for people who live in a coloring book. Well, depending on how well the young child is going to use the crayons. So when you are working on your coloring book, just try to keep in mind how the people who are being colored feel about it, feel about what you're doing. So after Jumanji was turned into a film, the studio, because it was successful, was excited about doing a sequel. And they spent actually a few years hiring writers to work on ideas or treatments. And they finally came up with an idea that was Jumanji in the White House. So they had this crazy idea that the President of the United States was in a little gift shop someplace on some diplomatic mission overseas, because in the end of the first film, the game is evidently in Europe. So anyway, the president buys the Jumanji game and he brings it back, and then all terrible things happen in Washington, D.C., and rhinoceroses charge the halls of Congress, and which doesn't sound much different from what's happening now. But it didn't sound like a promising idea to me dramatically, and I thought it was also repetitive. That, yeah, so you've got the opportunity, because you have a built-in sort of audience that like the idea of jungle things happening in places where you don't expect them. Just putting them in a different place you don't expect them is not going to really be that exciting. So I had a conversation with the producers, and I said, you know, when they did board games many years ago, they often printed a separate game on the back side of the board because you could play a second game with different characters, but it was economical. You didn't have to print a second board. So I wrote an idea about Jumanji that had on the back side a space adventure game, and it was called ZATHURA. So I wrote this up as a treatment, an idea, and I sent it to the producer. And because I'd asked him, I said, is there anything that could keep the studio from making Jumanji in the White House? And he said, only a better idea. And it's hard to know exactly how they measure that in Hollywood, but this is the one I provided. I said, okay, we'll use the same theme. It's a game that comes to life, but it's not a jungle game happening someplace else. It's a space adventure game. And space doesn't come to the house goes to space. So I thought that was a pretty nifty idea, and the studio did too. So they actually optioned the book before it was written, which made me feel like a big shot, like Michael Crichton, right? Because they would sell their books on the basis of a half-a-page description. Mine was longer than that. It was a full page, which was actually about the length of the story. But they optioned it as a film property based on that one page. So I felt relieved because Jumanji in the White House was not going to get made. And they did make ZATHURA, which I thought was a pretty good film, not as popular as Jumanji, partly because they didn't promote it, I think, as a sequel to Jumanji. But how many people have seen ZATHURA? Yeah, okay, so there's some high-key excitement in there, and there's some great kind of surrealistic images. I love the image where the boys go to the front door and they open up. They don't know where they are yet, and they go and open their front door and they see Saturn. You know, and I thought that was a terrific image. So PROBUDITI. This was a story which is based actually or inspired by old folk tales that I've always admired. And the themes of these folk tales which I admire are always about how the weak but clever individual can defeat the strong antagonist, the strong enemy. And in this case, it's a brother and sister. But there's a brother who torments his sister, who's really quite cruel to her. And then the brother's birthday comes along, and the little girl has an opportunity to really turn the tables on him. So she proves that it's actually it's cleverness that will always triumph over brute strength. And she has a terrific day, though her brother does not. So I like to try to challenge myself with different materials a lot. Even though my books do have a similarity, I always choose different materials to execute them in. But I also sort of like to try different subject matter. In this case, I was always interested in, or I haven't been always interested in it, but I remember as a child being really excited about reading the history of America as told in the biography of unusual Americans. Quirky Americans, brave Americans, iconoclastic Americans. So I had this memory of a woman going over Niagara Falls. This was not a dream, it actually happened. So I had this memory, but the memory was from an article I read in the late 60s in Sports Illustrated magazine about the daredevils of Niagara Falls. And I hadn't heard about it since I read it. I probably read about it in 1969, 1970. And it was such a distant memory, I thought, how am I going to find out that chapter of that history? And can I write Time Life? Could they go into their archives and help me look through their back issues? And then it occurred to me that I could just Google woman barrel Niagara Falls. And bingo, there she was, Annie Edson Taylor. So the first person to go over Niagara Falls was a woman, and she was about 63 years old. So I thought, that's an incredible story, and that was the kind of unusual American I was looking for. It wasn't clear to me what she signified or what part of the American character she revealed by doing what she did. Well, actually, maybe in the age of reality television, it's easier to understand why she did what she did, but I was drawn to this subject and happy to see when I Googled her that there was very little information existing about her, no picture books about Annie Taylor, and so I decided to tell her story. And one of the reasons I was interested in telling the story is because I knew in the course of illustrating it, I would be able to put the audience in places that are unusual, like in the barrel with Annie as she's going through the rapids. Because that's an unusual point of view, right? To be in a barrel with a terrified woman. Dressed inappropriately, I think, for the activity, but that's what she was wearing. Oh, I thought I had, excuse me, I thought I had another. No, just one of those, I guess. Okay. So anyway, this is my latest effort. So as I mentioned, I like to use different materials, and I'd never used watercolor before. I may never use it again. It's a very demanding material, and it's very unforgiving. But anyway, I went out and bought some watercolors and started experimenting with them. I used a little pencil in it too, I think you can see, but still, it's mostly watercolor and a challenging material. There's something in there I don't recognize. That little rectangle over the lamp on the right side, I don't think that's in the picture. Is that in the jacket? No. Okay, that's interesting, isn't it? Okay. Just wanted to make sure. So anyway, you don't see that rectangle's not on the lamp, is it? Okay, okay. Some glitch in the software. So anyway, this too was inspired by something fairly simple, namely that my children had 2 hamsters. And I'm sure that the discussion that happened in my house was like the discussions that have happened in many houses. Your child comes up to you at the age of 4, 5, 6, and they want a dog, right? Any of you have a hamster? Or a guinea pig, gerbil? Guinea pig? Right. So was that the first choice, or was the guinea pig a fallback from the dog? Yeah, okay. So that was the case in our household too, that my children wanted a dog, but we didn't think they were ready. We weren't quite ready either. And so we started to try to, bargain low, and we said, well, how about an ant farm? And they said, we aren't interested in an ant farm. I said, well, how about a little lizard? And they said, we are not interested in a lizard. A goldfish? No goldfish. So finally, we got up to the guinea pig, or excuse me, the hamster. And so we went to Petco, and it was kind of depressing to me because I knew that right away my children were looking at the hamster, but at the same time, they're stealing glances over their shoulder, really wanting the dog that was behind them, and it seemed unfair to the hamster that it was just a substitute. But they promised that they would love it, and I believed them, and they did actually for a little while. So we brought the hamster home, set it up, and learned all about the things you have to do to take care of a hamster and to make the hamster happy. And that's a challenge because even if you are dedicated and take the hamster out a lot and interact with it and let it run around the room, it's not a really happy hamster. And you know that at some point it's going to go back in the cage. All night long it's going to go around in its little rickety-tickety thing, and it's going to disturb your child. Your child's going to ask if you can keep it in your bedroom because it makes too much noise. So all of my predictions came true, and even though my wife and I tried to step in, and my children were not callous, uncaring children. They really loved the hamster, but it was too big a job for them. And so finally we had a conversation and decided that the hamster would go to the classroom, and it would become the classroom pet. So do any of you have classroom pets, little animals in the classroom? Yeah? Okay. So that's where our hamster went. And that hamster was named Marmalade. In fact, I dedicated the book to hamster, Marmalade. And a young companion or another one we had later on, didn't learn our lesson, Little Gray. So anyway, I started writing this story, and the way it started was fairly simple, that I just had things happen to the hamster that happened in my own family that, my children just love the idea of it. In Sweetie Pie's case, that's the hamster, the character, was left alone in the cage. Pet store cages have lots of hamsters in them. Sweetie Pie, in my story, was left alone because did not like being held. So every time a child picked up Sweetie Pie'd bite the kid. And so Sweetie Pie got left there a long time, but finally got lonely because what Sweetie Pie wanted was some hamster company. So finally a little girl comes and picks him up, and he wants to bite her, but he doesn't, because he believes that if she takes him away, that he will rejoin the other hamsters who've already left. Of course, he's not. He's just going to be alone with the little girl who loves him very much, but before long finds things that are more interesting to her. And as she begins to neglect him, she wants to prove that she still loves the hamster, and she does that by feeding him lots of food. And so the hamster loves to eat all that food. He becomes a very large hamster, like a water balloon. So at that point, she talks a young boy next door into maybe being the hamster's new owner, and he does in fact move next door to a boy who just happens to own a very large dog. So that's bad news for Sweetie Pie too, except for the anxiety of living with a dog makes it difficult for him to eat, so he loses a little weight. And then Sweetie Pie has to move on, and in this case, given to the boy's young cousin who thinks Sweetie Pie is a doll. And like a doll, you can dress it up and play with it and put it in a dollhouse. And Sweetie Pie doesn't like that. But the girl has other ideas about how to have fun with Sweetie Pie, including putting him in one of those plastic balls, which look like a lot of fun to human beings, but the hamsters kind of freak out because they aren't used to being on a surface that goes rockety, and so they just keep trying to claw to get to a better place, and as a result, they take off. And in this case, he took off downhill, and the little girl lost track of him. So here he goes downhill, slides through some traffic, and ends up in a park, and he's left there overnight. And then he's not sure if he's fortunate or lucky to see some kids the next day, but a little girl actually does see him laying in the grass and decides to pick him up and take him home, but she hasn't warned her mother yet. And so when she shows up with a hamster, and the hamster gets loose inside the house, the mother is convinced it's just a rat, and she tries to get rid of it with a broom. You can see that happening there. And there's Mom with the broom right there, ready to take another whack. So in the story, this hamster has the same fate that ours did, which is that it's now going to become a class pet. And so it goes from being handled not very much to handled quite a bit. You can see that the hamster at this point is getting a little worn out. So that day comes in the life of a class pet when the holidays approach. And what happens when the holidays approach? What does the class pet have to look forward to? Anybody know? Yeah, got to go home with somebody, right? So one child usually, me, maybe more than that. So that's what happened here. Of course, the boy didn't ask his mom or dad, but me, he wants it. So, of course, he's going to leave with the cage and the bag of food because he's going to take care of the hamster for the next 10 days of vacation. But on his way home, it begins to snow, but not so hard that he can't stop and play a little football with his friends, so they throw the ball around a little bit. But after playing ball, he just trots off and goes home because he forgot the hamster. So the hamster is there all night. And it begins to snow. And so I spent a little time writing this particular passage in the story. Before long, a blanket of white covered the wood chips in his cage. The sky got darker and the air grew colder. His teeth rattled, and Sweetie Pie suddenly felt bone tired. He wished he could stop shaking. Soon his wish was granted. The hamster became still. His eyes closed, and he fell into a deep and frigid sleep. So I felt that was a first in a children's book because I described the death by hypothermia of a small furry rodent. But there's a clue here in the picture because the savior of the hamster is in this picture, is actually in the spread. You can see it up there in the left. So the hamster is not alone. But what happens in the story, I should have given you a spoiler alert there, but what happens in the story is that when vacation's over, the boy comes back, but all he's got is an empty cage, and he confesses to the teacher and the rest of the class he forgot about the hamster, snowed that night. In the middle of the night, he went back to look for the hamster, but the cage was open and the hamster was gone. And all the students know what happened. This forgetful boy just left the cage open, and the hamster, as they know, was now buried under a snowdrift, frozen stiff as a popsicle. But the kids were not sad for very long because it was just following the holidays, and a young girl brings in her guinea pig, who's the new class pet. So the guinea pig moves into Sweetie Pie's old cage. So time passes, spring comes, and when it's warm enough to go out for recess, all the kids have forgotten about Sweetie Pie. Sweetie Pie wasn't there for all that long. But there's one person who does not forget about Sweetie Pie, and it's the boy who still felt guilty about leaving Sweetie Pie out in the snow. And so when he goes out to play, in recess, he can't help himself. He's looking under bushes because he's afraid he's going to see Sweetie Pie's little dried up carcass. So what it says here, during recess, he could not keep his eyes from searching beneath bushes and dried leaves. Where could Sweetie Pie be? Had the boy looked up instead of down, he would have found the answer. High above the playground, a pair of squirrels moved quickly through the trees. They crawled into a leaf-filled hollow made warm by their friends who were nesting there. The squirrels cracked off pieces of acorn with their sharp teeth and shared the food with their small, tailless comrade. It was not as tasty as the food he'd had when he was younger, but looking out of the nest, with his friends right behind him and the children 30 feet below, with no bars between him and the deep blue sky, Sweetie Pie felt like the luckiest squirrel in the tree. So the normal course the normal kind of narrative thing that would happen in a story like this would be that you'd have 3 or 4 bad kids, but then the hamster would get lucky and there'd be a tender, loving child who knew exactly what the hamster wanted, and they would be best friends for life, and the hamster would live a full and happy life. But as I worked on it, I realized, well, even under those conditions, even with a child who really cared, it still meant a life in a cage. It still meant a life separate from other life forms. And I realize I've taken some liberties here because this interspecies friendship is unlikely. But still, the idea of being back with creatures that were similar to him and his willingness to chew on these bitter acorns in exchange for the freedom of living a life that had no bars and had blue sky, it was all worth it. So that's really the premise of the story, and they're probably not going to be selling the book at Petco. But I thought, I mean, I'm not going to, make high claims for it, but, in the scheme of things, it's a bona fide kind of PETA issue, I mean, if you're worried about the ethical treatment of animals, it really starts here, and it starts with a conversation about how happy is this animal that you want to bring into the house, that we're all going to bring into the house. How happy are they going to be living in that stinky cage? So anyway, that's the story of Sweetie Pie. And so I'm happy now to entertain some questions of yours. Okay. Let's try a few. Yes, right here. Okay, the question is, how did the story of the Polar Express come to me? And that's unusual amongst all the stories because I merely had to recall it. When I was 8, it all happened. Memory was buried for a long time. If somebody asked me when I was 12, I could not have remembered it. But when I turned about, let's see, it was 30 years ago. So when I was about 35, I started having these memories of this train that pulled up in front of my house. So when I started to write it, often when you write a story, you make false starts and you have to go part way in, you come back. That's not leading you in the right place. But when I started writing the Polar Express, I wrote it out in a single draft because, and I'm speaking somewhat metaphorically, it really felt exactly like a memory to me. It's of all the stories that I talked about up here, it's the one that took me the least amount of time because I'm still willing to claim it as a memory. Fritz the dog, yes. So, the first book I wrote, as I told you, I was not an experienced illustrator. So I actually kind of made up the people. I made up a lot of things in it. But I couldn't make up the bull terrier because I wanted it to be a bull terrier, so I needed one. And my brother-in-law happened to be visiting at about that time, and he said he was going to buy a dog. He said he was going to get a golden retriever, and I said, "That's not a very interesting dog. Ever thought about a bull terrier?" And he went back to Detroit where he lived, and he called a breeder, and he called me up. He said, "Hey, guess what? I got this really nice dog. It's a bull terrier." So I said, "I'm on my way." So I went out there and I made drawings, took pictures of this dog, which he named Winston. It was really a very nice dog. These dogs are lethally territorial around other dogs, but around people they can be just sweethearts, and this dog was one. And so developed a relationship with the dog. Probably 2 or 3 months after the book was published, the dog got hit by a truck. Thought it owned the road, so because they are territorial. So I thought I would always remember that dog because of its contribution to my first book. His name was Winston in real life. In the book, his character is Fritz, but he's Winston. I would always put Winston in each subsequent book. So he is in some form in every other book. Yes.
What do you like to do when you're working and you kind of get stuck?
Okay, question is, what do I like to do when I'm working and I get stuck? It doesn't happen. You know, I mean, one of the things about, I shouldn't say that. I mean, sometimes I get stuck. Sometimes I get stuck writing a little bit, and maybe the best thing to do then is just to go away from it for a little while, but not long. You know, I never get stuck drawing because I just think visually, and if a drawing's not working out, no big deal, throw it over. Not anything that's very finished, but you know, sketches. I sketch a lot, so I never really get roadblocked or blocked doing the pictures. But yeah, in fairness, so what do you do when I get kind of blocked with a story? Usually, it's just a matter of walking away from it and you know, taking a walk and thinking about it rather than actually writing it down. So. Okay. Okay. This one was. Yeah. How many books have I written? Well, I think in my introduction it was 17, but I think it's actually 19. I think this is the 19th. I'd have to go back and count, but I'm pretty sure I've written 19. Yeah, I think this is the 19th. What's that? Yeah, okay. Yes, I am, because I think that there are stories I would like to tell that I haven't told. There are materials that I'd like to draw with that I haven't drawn with. And that question goes along with another one that I'm often asked, which is of the books I've done, which is my favorite. And my answer to that, which I always used to think was really clever and insightful and would get me in the Bartlett's book of quotations, was I would always say, my next book. But then I learned that Frank Lloyd Wright had been saying that for years. His favorite building was his next one, but our rationales were the same. I will do another book because it will be my favorite, and it will be my favorite because it will be better than the ones I've done so far. So that's it.